Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins.
The land of Mordor lay in silence. Long had it groaned beneath the weight of shadow, but now the Dark Lord was no more, his tower thrown down, and his hosts scattered like ash upon the wind. Where once stood the dreadful Barad-dûr, there was now a heap of blackened stone, broken iron, and jagged ruins that smoldered still, though the ring of power had perished. Yet silence, though it ruled the plain, was not a silence of peace. It was heavy, watchful, as though the ground itself remembered its master's cruelty and clung to dark secrets not yet revealed. From the west came a company of riders cloaked in gray and black, bearing the white emblem of Gondor. They rode cautiously, their horses stamping upon the dust of Gorgoroth. At their head was a young captain, tall and strong, his face marked by both the nobility of his father's house and the fire of youth not yet dimmed. His name was Elberron, son of Faramir, and grandson of the great Denethor, though he bore little of that dark steward's pride. Instead, he carried his father's wisdom and his mother Eowyn's valor, though in him both mingled with the eagerness of one who sought to prove his worth in deeds of his own. Elberron guided his company to the very foot of the ruins where Barad-dûr once had risen. The sun, pale through a haze of smoke, cast long shadows over the broken field. Here and there, pieces of twisted iron jutted from the stones, like the bones of a slain beast. His men dismounted, their voices low, for none wished to speak loudly in this place. "By the command of King Elessar," said Elberron, his voice steady, though his eyes strayed uneasily to the mountain of rubble before them, "we are charged to search these ruins. It is said that the enemy's works were deep, and though the tower has fallen, who can say what lingers beneath? Some whisper that vaults remain untouched, and the king would see them scoured, lest some servant of darkness find harbor there." The rangers murmured assent, though their faces were grim. All of them had seen battle in the War of the Ring, and though they rejoiced in the enemy's downfall, they knew too well the cunning of Mordor. As they set their camp at the edge of the ruins, Elberron walked apart, his thoughts heavy. He had begged leave of his father to join this venture, for he longed to do more than merely inherit the steward's seat one day. He wanted to test his mettle in the world beyond the fair woods of Ithilien. And yet, as he gazed at the shattered wreckage of Barad-dûr, unease crept upon him. It was as though the ruins themselves watched, patient and waiting. That night the company lit no fires. They sat close together, their cloaks drawn about them, for though the eye was gone, the very air of Mordor seemed to chill their bones. The stars above were veiled by a thin, choking mist that drifted from the cracks of the land. In the silence they heard the groaning of shifting stones within the heap, as though the ruin yet breathed. One of the men, a grizzled ranger named Ardamir, spoke in a hushed tone. "Captain, have you heard the tales? Some say that Barad-dûr was built not by stonecraft alone, but by sorcery. They say the very foundations were woven with spells, too deep for ruin to undo. What if there are chambers still, hidden beneath all this wreckage? What if—" He fell silent, his eyes dark with unspoken fear. Elberron laid a firm hand on his shoulder. "That is what we are here to discover. The king does not suffer shadows to remain, not even in thought. We will search, and if we find such places, we will cleanse them." Yet even as he spoke bravely, a whisper of doubt stirred in him, for he had dreamt, in the nights before setting out, of doors beneath the earth and voices calling from the dark. At dawn, the company began their search. They clambered over the ruin, prying aside fallen beams of iron and rolling stones that bore the scars of fire. Strange carvings they found upon shards of black stone, marks like twisted runes, burned deep as if by claw or flame. Nothing of worth lay upon the surface, only rubble and the stench of old smoke. But near the base of the ruin, half buried under slabs of obsidian rock, they discovered an opening. It was no natural crack, but a stairway descending into shadow. The stones of its archway were scorched, but still stood, and upon them was written in a tongue none of the men knew. The air that breathed from below was cold and foul, as though untouched by the cleansing wind of the world above. A murmur passed among the rangers. Some drew back, unwilling to descend into the heart of what once had been the dark tower. Elberon looked upon them and saw fear plain in their eyes, though not one of them would speak it aloud. "This is what we came for," he said. "The king commanded us to seek what lies hidden, and I will not return to Minas Tirith saying we left the work half done." And with that, Elberon drew his sword. Its steel shone faintly in the dim light, and his heart steadied as his fingers closed upon the hilt. He turned toward the stairway and began to descend the first into the darkness beneath Barad-dûr. One by one, the rangers followed. The sound of their boots upon the stone echoed strangely, as though the stairway stretched deeper than it seemed. The last light of day dwindled behind them, and the shadows closed like a curtain. The secrets of Barad-dûr waited below, and none knew what fate would meet them in the depths. The stairway spiraled down, its stones damp and cold, though no water dripped from the roof. It seemed as if the very walls wept, with a darkness older than memory. Their torches burned low, the flames shivering as though reluctant to reveal what lay ahead. Elberon led, his sword drawn, the point gleaming faintly in the half-light. Behind him the rangers came one by one, their shadows long upon the wall. No one spoke. Even the boldest of them felt the weight of silence pressing down. The further they went, the more the stair seemed to resist their passage, as though the air thickened to slow their steps. And though the tower above was ruined, this place remained unbroken. The walls were smooth, carved from black rock and marked with strange symbols that glimmered faintly as if holding a ghost of fire long extinguished. At last, the stair ended in a great hall, vast and echoing. The roof was lost in shadow, upheld by pillars of stone shaped like serpents, their heads bowed as if in mockery of obeisance. In the center lay a cracked floor of obsidian tiles, black as night, with veins of red running through them like frozen blood. "This place was never touched by the ruin above," whispered Ardamir, his voice trembling. "It is as if the fall of Barad-dûr never reached here." Elberon said nothing. His eyes scanned the hall, every sense straining. There was no sound, no breath of air, yet he felt a presence, as though the hall itself listened. They crossed the chamber slowly, their torchlight casting wavering shadows upon the floor. At the far side stood a door of black iron, tall and arched, its surface etched with marks that writhed faintly when the firelight touched them. Elberon reached out a hand, but the metal was colder than ice, so cold it burned his skin. He pulled back sharply. "It is sealed by sorcery," murmured one of the men. "Shall we leave it, Captain?" Elberon hesitated. In his heart he knew that beyond this door lay the very secret they sought. To turn back now would mean leaving their task undone. Yet he also felt a warning deep within, as though some part of him cried out against disturbing what lay beyond. Still, his will was firm. "The king bade us cleanse this place," he said. "We cannot stop at the first shadow that bars the way. Help me." Together they pressed against the iron. The runes flared dimly, and a shudder passed through the hall like the groan of a beast disturbed in slumber. With a grinding cry, the door swung open. A gust of foul air rushed out, snuffing their torches to stubs and making the men cough and choke. Beyond lay a passage narrower than the hall, winding deeper into the earth. Here the walls were rougher, as though hewn in haste, but the floor was worn smooth by many steps, and upon the walls were carvings, grotesque faces twisted in silent screams, their eyes set with shards of dull glass that caught the torchlight in sickly glimmers. As they went on, the air grew heavier still. Strange sounds drifted on the silence, whispers too soft to catch, or perhaps only the beating of their own hearts, echoing strangely. But Elberon felt the voices brushing against his mind, urging him to turn back, warning him of doom, or else calling him onward with promises he dared not understand. At last, they came to another chamber, smaller but more dreadful than the first. Here the walls were lined with niches, and in each lay relics of war, broken blades, shattered helms, and shields blackened with fire. Yet none were of orc make. These were weapons of Numenor, ancient and proud, now marred and ruined. The rangers looked on in horror. Ardamir picked up a helm whose crest had been torn away. "These are the arms of our fathers," he whispered. "How came they here? Surely these were taken from the fallen long ago." Elberon's brow darkened. He thought of the long wars against Mordor, when countless men of Gondor had fallen and their bodies been carried away by orcs. Sauron had not merely slain them, he had hoarded their arms here in mockery, a trophy hall of Gondor's grief. "Leave them," Elberon said, his voice tight with anger. "Let no man take aught from this place. These were dishonored by the enemy, and so shall they remain until the world is cleansed." They pressed on. The chamber gave way to a stair of black marble, leading downward again, ever downward, as though into the very roots of the earth. Here the torches guttered, and more than once they nearly went out altogether. At the foot of the stair they found themselves in a cavern vast and echoing, its roof lost in gloom. In the center rose a dais of stone, and upon it rested a coffer bound in iron, its surface carved with runes that glowed faintly red. The coffer pulsed with light as if something within still lived or longed to live again. No one moved for a long while. Even Elberon felt his courage waver before the sight of it. There was power here and malice. One of the younger rangers, eager and reckless, stepped forward. "Captain," he said, "is this not what we came for? Should we not see what lies within?" But before Elberon could answer, the ground shuddered. A deep rumble rose from the stone, and out of the shadows on either side of the dais came shapes, figures wrought of stone and ash, their forms half man, half beast, their eyes glowing like coals. They moved with the grinding sound of rock upon rock, yet there was will in them and hunger. The men drew back in fear, their blades flashing out. "Hold fast," Elberon cried. His heart pounded, but he stood his ground, raising his sword. Whatever foul guardians linger here, they will not bar our way. 2 arms, rangers of Gondor. The chamber filled with the sound of steel ringing, stone cracking, and the harsh cries of men as the first of the creatures descended upon them. And so began the battle beneath Barad-dûr. The chamber erupted into chaos. The stone guardians moved with a dreadful slowness that belied their strength. Each step made the floor tremble, and when their great arms swung down, the air cracked like thunder. Sparks flew as one of them struck the floor, where a ranger had been standing only moments before, shattering stone and sending fragments clattering across the cavern. "Keep to their flanks," Elberon shouted, his voice echoing in the gloom. He darted forward, his sword flashing silver in the torchlight, and struck at the nearest guardian's arm. The blade rang against stone, sending a shock through his wrist, but a line of sparks showed where steel had bitten into the rock. The guardian turned its burning gaze upon him, and for a heartbeat, Elberon felt as though the fire in those eyes would sear his very soul. He staggered back, barely raising his shield in time as the creature's fist came crashing down. The impact drove him to one knee, his arm shaking with the force of it. "Captain!" cried Ardamir, leaping forward, his spear thrust true, striking into a crack at the guardian's side. With a terrible groan, the creature lurched, and the red light in its eyes flickered, yet still it stood, wrenching itself free of the blow, as though pain were nothing to it. Around them, the battle raged. 2 rangers fought back to back against another guardian, their blades chipping stone bit by bit. Every strike took courage, for the creatures did not bleed, nor did they falter. Each wound seemed but a scratch upon their vast frames, while every blow they struck was enough to break bone and sunder shield. One of the younger men, Leorthil, sprang forward too boldly. He sought to drive his blade into the chest of one guardian, but his footing slipped on the cracked tiles. The stone hand closed around him in an instant. He screamed as he was lifted from the ground, his sword falling from his grasp. "No!" Elberon roared. With all the strength left in him, he surged up and brought his sword down in a sweeping cut across the guardian's wrist. Steel clanged and sparks leapt. At last, the stone cracked beneath his stroke. With a roar like breaking mountains, the guardian's hand split apart, crumbling to fragments. Leorthil tumbled to the ground, coughing and trembling, but alive. "Fall back to the dais," Elberon commanded, dragging the boy to his feet. "Use the coffer as cover. Keep them before us." The rangers obeyed, retreating step by step until they stood together in a tight circle around the iron-bound chest. There were only 3 guardians in all, but each was worth a company of foes. Their glowing eyes burned brighter now, and as they advanced, the runes on the coffer seemed to pulse in answer, as though the creatures drew strength from its presence. Ardamir, panting, leaned close to Elberon. "Captain, they will not tire. We cannot outlast them. What are we to do?" Elberon's gaze fell upon the coffer. It pulsed again, light seeping from the cracks between the runes, as though a heart beat within. A thought came to him, dark and dangerous. If the guardians drew their power from it, what if it could also be turned against them? "We must break it," Elberon said, his voice low. "It may be that these creatures are bound to it. Destroy the coffer, and perhaps their strength will fail?" The rangers exchanged uneasy glances. None wished to touch the chest. The very air around it hummed with malice, and a voice seemed to whisper at the edge of hearing, promising power, promising dominion. Yet Elberon stood firm. "Sir, hold him off," he cried. "I will see it done." He sheathed his sword, grasped his shield tighter in one hand, and with the other reached for the hilt of his dagger. Step by step he approached the coffer. The heat of it was like a forge fire, though its surface was cold as death. He lifted the dagger high and drove it down with all his might. The blade struck, and light flared. A scream filled the chamber, not from any throat of man or beast, but from the coffer itself, a wail that pierced their ears and hearts. The guardians staggered as though struck, their glowing eyes dimming. "Again!" Elberon shouted, though his hand shook from the force of the blow. He struck once more, and the iron bands cracked, red fire spilling through the breach. The guardians howled in voices like grinding stone, lurching forward with renewed fury. One swept its arm across the dais, scattering rangers like leaves in a storm. Another brought its fist down upon Ardemir's shield, splintering wood and hurling him to the floor. But Elberon did not falter. A third strike split the coffer wide. From within burst a light so fierce that all were blinded. The scream rose to a shriek and then broke into silence. When Elberon's sight cleared, the guardians were gone. Where they had stood were only piles of broken rock, crumbled as if by ages of weather. The coffer lay shattered, its runes extinguished, its fragments smoking. Whatever had been bound within was no more. The chamber fell quiet. The only sound was the harsh breathing of the men and the faint drip of water from the cavern roof. Elberon sank to his knees, exhausted, his hands shaking. The dagger had melted in his grip, leaving only a hilt of charred iron. Ardemir rose slowly, leaning on his spear. "You have done it, Captain," he said, his voice hoarse. "They are ended." But Elberon's heart was not at ease. He looked at the shattered coffer and felt no triumph, only unease. For in the brief moment when it had broken, he thought he had seen something within, a shape, formless yet vast, that had fled like smoke. Where it had gone, he could not say. Still, he forced himself to rise. "Gather the men," he said. "We will return to the surface and tell the king what we have found. But not a word of this coffer must be spoken beyond our company. If ever such things are remembered, they may call shadows back into the world." The rangers nodded, their faces pale. One by one they retrieved their fallen weapons and made ready to depart. Yet as they turned to climb the stairs once more, Elberon cast a last glance at the shattered remains. The red glow had faded, yet in the silence he thought he heard a whisper still, faint as the rustling of dry leaves. "This is not the end." Shivering, he turned away and followed his men into the long, dark stair. The stairway seemed longer in their retreat than it had in their descent. Each step groaned under their boots, and the air pressed heavily on their lungs as though the darkness itself tried to hold them back. Elberon carried the rear, his sword drawn, though his arm trembled from the battle. The others moved ahead in silence, and none dared glance over his shoulder for fear that the shadows might follow. When at last they reached the vast, serpent-pillared hall, the torches sputtered with relief as though the stale air had been left behind. Yet even here, the atmosphere felt changed. The pillars leaned strangely, as though watching, and the floor shone faintly red beneath their boots. Elberon urged them forward without pause, unwilling to linger. By the time they reached the ruined stair that led upward into the wreckage of Barad-dûr, most of the men were stumbling with weariness. Elberon's own legs ached, but his spirit drove him onward. He had heard the whisper at the coffers breaking, faint but unmistakable, and though the guardians were destroyed, he feared that something worse had been loosed. They emerged at last into the gray daylight. The sun was low over the Efelduath, its light dim behind the shrouds of smoke that lingered always above Gorgoroth. Still, after the choking blackness below, the pale light seemed a gift of Valinor itself. The rangers paused, some falling to their knees to breathe deeply of the open air. Ardamir came to Elberon's side, his face worn but resolute. "We are alive, Captain, though it was near enough to another tale entirely. Shall we strike camp and return at once?" Elberon nodded. "Yes, we will ride by night if need be. The sooner we carry word to the king, the sooner this shadow may be laid to rest." Yet even as he said the words, he looked back at the shattered ruin behind them. The great mound of broken iron and stone loomed like a mountain of ash, silent and brooding. In its depths lay the remnants of chambers none would ever wholly uncover. He could not rid himself of the thought that Barad-dûr's secrets were not yet done with them. The rangers moved quickly, breaking down their small camp and leading out the horses. The beasts whickered nervously, stamping their hooves, for they too had felt the weight of the place. It was near sunset when the company set out across the desolate plain of Gorgoroth. The land stretched bleak and lifeless, dotted with pits and slag heaps where furnaces once blazed. To the north loomed the smoldering cone of Orodruin, Mount Doom, its fires quenched, but its scars still red. No bird wheeled overhead, no water flowed. Only wind whispered over stone. The men rode in silence, their cloaks tight about them as though the plain itself might rise up and listen to their words. For a time all was quiet, and Elberon began to hope they would leave Mordor without further trial. But as the night deepened and the shadows lengthened, strange sounds reached their ears. At first it was only a scraping, as of stone against stone. Then came a low moan, carrying across the plain. "Do you hear it?" whispered Leorthil, the young ranger whose life Elberon had saved from the Guardian's grasp. His eyes were wide, his hand white on his reins. "I hear," Elberon said grimly. "Keep your courage, lad. We have faced worse." But in truth his heart quickened. The sound was not of any beast he knew, nor the groaning of shifting earth. It was too measured, too deliberate. The company pressed on, but the noises followed, scrapings, moans, and faint whispers, as though unseen things moved just beyond the ring of torchlight. Twice the horses balked, and once they reared in panic, nearly unseating their riders. Elberon ordered them to ride faster, and for a while the noises faded behind them. Yet when the moon rose over the Efelduath, pale and thin, they saw movement. Far off across the plain, shadows flitted between the slag heaps. They were small and swift, too distant to discern clearly, but their numbers were many. "Orcs?" asked Ardamir, narrowing his eyes. "No," Elberon replied after a long look. "The orcs are scattered. They would not move so silently, nor in such numbers without cry or fire. These are something else." His words chilled the men more than silence. For if the creatures were not orcs, what were they? The shadows followed them all that night, never drawing near, never falling away. When dawn came, pale and sickly, they vanished, as though melted into the rocks. The men breathed easier, but unease remained like a stone in their bellies. That evening, as they camped at the western edge of Gorgoroth, where the land dipped toward Nurn, Elberon called his men together. "You all know what we found. he said quietly, his voice low lest the dark hear. "Guardians bound to a coffer of foul power. We broke it, but I fear in the breaking we set free what was within. I cannot say what form it may take, nor when it will show itself, but mark me well. We are not alone in these wastes. Something follows." The men listened, their faces grave. None doubted him. The youngest shivered, but Ardamir clasped his shoulder. "What would you have us do, Captain?" "Keep watch," Elberon said. "Sleep in turns. Ride swift and ride wary. And when we reach Ithilien, we will speak of this only to the king. None other must know. Secrets such as these are better buried." That night, Elberon took the first watch. He stood upon a low ridge, his cloak wrapped close against the chill, and gazed out across the dark plain. In the distance, the ruin of Barad-dûr was a black silhouette against the stars. As he watched, he thought he saw a faint red glimmer deep within the rubble, like the last coal of a dying fire. He blinked, and it was gone. Yet he could not shake the feeling that something down there had awakened, and that it looked now upon him. Toward midnight, as the camp lay quiet, Elberon heard the sound again, the scraping of stone, the faint rustle of unseen feet. He gripped his sword and peered into the gloom. And then, for the briefest moment, he saw them. Figures, low and hunched, creeping along the plain. Their eyes glowed faintly, not red like the Guardians, but pale like dead stars. They moved with a horrid grace, half shadow, half solid, as though they had been born from the very ruins themselves. Elberon's breath caught. He knew then that the whisper he had heard at the breaking of the coffer had not lied. This was not the end. Something had been unbound, and it had taken shape in these twisted wretches that now prowled the dark. He did not cry out for fear of rousing the camp into panic. Instead, he tightened his hand on his sword and whispered to the night, "Whatever you are, you will not pass into Gondor, not while I yet live." The pale eyes blinked once, then vanished into the shadows, but Elberon knew they would return. The company left their camp at dawn, the pale light filtering weakly through the haze that hung always over Mordor. The men were weary, their eyes hollow from broken sleep, but none complained. They saddled their horses swiftly, eager to be away from the shadow of Barad-dûr. The land changed as they moved south and west. The cracked plains of Gorgoroth gave way to uneven ridges, where black stone thrust from the ground like jagged teeth. Once this had been the domain of orc forges and furnaces, though now all lay cold. Still the scars remained. Deep pits where iron had been drawn, chimneys leaning like broken fingers, and rivers of ash hardened to glass. No green thing grew, and no bird sang. Elberon rode at the front, his eyes always scanning the horizon. Behind him came Ardamir, silent and steady, followed by Leorthil and the rest of the company. The younger men whispered from time to time, but their voices were hushed, as though they feared to stir the dark. By noon the sun had climbed high, though its light was dimmed by the shroud of smoke. The horses slowed, their flanks heaving with the strain of the barren road. Elberon raised his hand. "We rest here," he said, pointing to a hollow between two ridges. "Keep watch on every side. We will not linger long." The men dismounted with relief. Some sank to the ground, chewing on dried meat from their packs. Others tended the horses, rubbing their necks and offering them what little water remained. Elberon stood apart, gazing back the way they had come. The plain behind them lay silent, yet he could not shake the feeling of being followed. He thought of the pale eyes he had glimpsed the night before, glimmering like stars that had fallen to earth. Ardamir approached, his spear resting against his shoulder. "You saw them too, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Elberon's jaw tightened. "I did, though I know not what name to give them." "They were no orcs," Ardamir said. "No beast of Mordor either. They moved like shadows, but left marks in the ash. Did you notice? There were footprints about the camp this morning, small but deep. They circled us in the night." Elberon nodded grimly. "They are bound to the coffer somehow. When it broke, something was released. Perhaps fragments of the enemy's will. Perhaps worse." "Then we should ride faster," Ardamir said. "If they follow, let them chase us into Ithilien. There, at least, we will have strength to meet them." "Perhaps," Elberon murmured. But in his heart he feared that to bring such things into Ithilien would be to spread the shadow further. Still, he gave the order, and the company mounted once more. All that afternoon they rode without pause, the wind whipping their cloaks. Once or twice the men thought they saw movement on the ridges, shapes flitting from stone to stone. But when they turned their gaze, nothing stood there. At last, as dusk fell, they came to the northern edge of the plain of Nirn. Before them stretched a wide land scarred by years of slavery and toil, but not wholly barren. Far in the distance lay the great inland sea of Nirnen, its waters catching the last glimmer of daylight. The men murmured softly, for the sight of water after so much ash and dust stirred hope in their hearts. But that hope was short-lived. From the ridges behind them rose a sound, a chorus of thin wails, half scream, half laugh. It echoed strangely, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The horses shied and snorted in terror, nearly throwing their riders. "They come!" cried Leorthil, his voice breaking. Elberon wheeled his horse, his sword flashing in the dim light. At first he saw nothing, only the long shadows of the ridges. Then slowly they emerged. Dozens of them. Figures hunched and twisted, no taller than a man's chest, their limbs too long and thin, their skin gray and cracked like old stone. Their eyes glowed faintly white, cold and distant, and their mouths hung open in silent grins. They moved with unnerving grace, slipping from rock to rock, as though the ground itself bore them forward. The rangers tightened their ranks, forming a defensive circle around the horses. "What are they?" whispered one of the men. "Does it matter?" Ardamir growled, lowering his spear. "They bleed, or they do not. But either way, we hold them here." The creatures drew closer, their pale eyes fixed on the men. They did not rush nor cry, but advanced in eerie silence. Then, as if at a signal, they leapt. The first wave came skittering down the rocks, their claws outstretched. Steel flashed as the rangers met them. Swords rang, spears thrust, and the air filled with the shrieks of battle. Elberon's blade cut through one creature's chest, and to his shock, it crumbled like ash, dissolving into dust that blew away on the wind. But another sprang onto his horse, clawing at its neck. The beast reared in terror, and Elberon struck again, severing the creature's arm before it too dissolved into nothing. "Strike them hard," he cried. "They are not of flesh. They are shadows given shape." The men fought bravely, their blades cutting down the pale-eyed horrors one by one. Yet for every creature destroyed, two more seemed to appear from the gloom. The circle tightened, the horses screaming in fear. Ardamir thrust his spear through the chest of one creature, pinning it to the ground. "They do not die as men die," he shouted. "It is as if they are smoke-bound to stone." Leorthil, pale but determined, cried out, "Then we must scatter them, drive them off before they swarm us." Elberon's mind raced. He thought of the coffers breaking, of the red light spilling forth, of the formless shadow that had fled. Could these creatures be fragments of that shadow, given bodies of dust and ash? If so, perhaps only fire or light could banish them fully. "Torches!" he shouted. "Light the torches!" The men obeyed at once, fumbling for flint and steel even as they fought. Soon flames sprang to life, small at first, but growing brighter. The effect was immediate. The creatures shrieked in unison, recoiling from the light. Their pale eyes blinked, and several dissolved into dust before the fire's glare. "Hold them back!" Elberon roared, lifting a torch high in his left hand and his sword in his right. He swung both fiercely, the light scattering the creatures that dared come near. "Drive them away!" The men rallied, torches blazing in their fists. One by one, the pale-eyed things shrieked and fled, slipping back into the ridges. Their cries echoed for a long while, then faded into silence. At last only dust remained on the ground, and the men stood panting in the flicker of firelight. "By the Valar," whispered Leorthil. "What were those things?" Elberon lowered his torch, his face grim. "Remnants," he said softly. "Remnants of the shadow. They will not rest until they are destroyed, or until they find what they seek." "And what do they seek?" asked Ardamir. Elberon looked out across the dark plain toward the distant ruins of Barad-dûr. His heart told him the answer, though he dared not speak it aloud. "They seek what was lost when the tower fell," he said at last, "and if we do not stop them, they may find it yet." The company set their camp upon the ridge that night, the torches burning bright in a ring around them. None slept deeply, for the memory of pale eyes haunted them, and Elberon, lying awake beneath the stars, heard again in his heart the whisper he had tried to forget. "This is not the end." The torches burned through the night, their flames crackling in the dry air. The rangers kept watch in pairs, their eyes fixed on the ridges beyond the firelight. No movement stirred, no sound came, yet every man felt the unseen eyes upon them. The horses, restless and shivering, stamped their hooves and snorted as though they too knew that danger lingered just beyond the glow. Elberon slept little. When at last he closed his eyes, dark dreams plagued him. He saw the shattered coffer lying on its dais, the red light seeping out like blood. He heard again the shriek of its breaking, and then he saw shapes forming from smoke and ash, figures with pale eyes that turned toward him, their mouths open in silent laughter. He woke with a start, his hand upon his sword, and found only the steady crackle of the torches and the weary eyes of Ardamir keeping watch. "Rest, Captain," Ardamir said quietly. "I will wake you if they come." But Elberon could not rest. He walked to the edge of the fire's circle and looked out into the darkness. The night was cold, and the sky above was veiled by thin clouds. For a long while he listened, and though no sound reached him, his skin prickled as if invisible hands brushed against it. At dawn they set out again, the pale light of morning bringing little comfort. They rode swiftly, skirting the northern edges of Nurn, where the land began to soften into hills. Sparse grass grew here, yellow and brittle, but to the rangers it was a welcome sight. It meant they were leaving the heart of Mordor behind. Yet the pale-eyed shadows followed. By midday, Elberon saw them again. Far behind at the crest of a ridge, dark figures slipped between the stones. He counted at least 20 before they vanished. His men saw them too, and a murmur ran through the company. "They are not gone," Leorthil whispered, his voice trembling. "They will not be gone," Elberon said firmly, "but we will not let them overtake us. Keep your courage. Gondor has faced worse and prevailed." They pressed on, driving the horses hard. Dust rose in clouds behind them, and the sun climbed, weak but steady, across the sky. From time to time, the rangers glanced back, and always they caught glimpses of movement, shadows flitting just out of reach, pale eyes gleaming faintly. By evening, they reached a narrow pass between two ridges. The path was strewn with broken stone, but it was the only way forward. Elberon halted at its mouth and studied the ground. "They will strike here," he said. "The pass is too narrow for us to ride through unguarded. If they mean to fall upon us, it will be in such a place." Ardamir frowned. "Shall we take another path?" "There is none," Elberon replied, "but we can prepare." The men dismounted, moving swiftly under Elberon's orders. They piled stones at the pass's entrance to form a barrier, leaving a narrow gap for their horses. Torches were readied and spears set against the rocks. When the sun dipped behind the ridges and shadows stretched long, the rangers stood ready. The first cry came at dusk. A high, shrill wail echoed through the pass, and from the rocks above the creatures came. They poured down in a wave, their pale eyes blazing, their limbs moving with unnatural speed. "Hold!" Elberon shouted. His sword gleamed as he met the first of them, cutting it down in a burst of ash. Around him, the rangers fought fiercely, their torches blazing, their steel flashing in the dim light. The creatures shrieked as the fire touched them, but still they came, leaping from rock to rock, clawing at the men with thin, wiry arms. One landed upon a horse, dragging the beast down with snapping teeth. Another seized a ranger by the throat, its grip strong as iron, until Ardamir's spear thrust through its chest and scattered it to dust. The battle raged in the narrow pass. The rangers fought shoulder to shoulder, their torches driving the pale-eyed horrors back step by step. Yet the creatures were many, and for everyone that fell, another pressed forward. The men's arms grew weary, and the flames of the torches guttered low. "Captain," cried Leorthil, his face pale with sweat and ash, "they are too many." Elberon's heart pounded. He looked around, seeking some way to turn the tide. His gaze fell upon the ridge above them, jagged and loose with stone. An idea came to him, dangerous but desperate. "Ardamir," he shouted, "with me, the rest hold them here." Together they scrambled up the side of the ridge, stones shifting beneath their boots. The creatures hissed and leapt, some turning to follow, but the rangers below held them back with torches and steel. At the top, Elberon drew his sword and thrust it deep into a crack between the rocks. He heaved with all his strength. The stones groaned, then shifted, then gave way. With a roar like thunder, the ridge collapsed. An avalanche of rock poured down into the pass, sweeping the pale-eyed creatures away. Dust rose in a choking cloud, and the ground shook beneath the force of the fall. The rangers scrambled clear. As the stones tumbled, their cries lost in the tumult. When at last the rumble faded, silence fell. The pass lay choked with rock and dust. Of the creatures nothing remained, only faint traces of ash among the stones. The men stood gasping, their faces gray with dust, their torches sputtering in the thin air. Elberon climbed down slowly, his sword still in his hand, and looked upon the ruin they had wrought. "We cannot tarry here," he said. "If more come, we are trapped. Mount up, and we ride." Though weary and shaken, the rangers obeyed. They pressed onward through the night, skirting the edge of Nurn and driving their horses into the foothills that rose toward Ithilien. The stars shone faintly above, and for the first time in many days, Elberon felt the breath of clean air. Yet his heart was not eased. He knew the avalanche had not destroyed them all. These were no ordinary foes, bound by stone and shadow. They would return as long as the remnants of the coffer's power endured, and he feared what might happen when they reached the borders of Gondor. That night, as they made camp in the shelter of a rocky hollow, Ardamir came to him. "You saved us again, Captain," he said, lowering himself to the ground beside Elberon. "But how long can we go on like this? We cannot fight shadows forever." Elberon stared into the flames of the campfire. "No," he said softly, "we cannot. That is why we must reach the king. Only he can judge what must be done, for this shadow is not ours to master." Ardamir nodded, though his eyes were troubled. When the others slept, Elberon remained awake, listening to the wind whispering among the rocks. And once again, faint and distant, he heard the voice he dreaded most. This is not the end. For 2 more days they rode, keeping to the broken hills and dry gullies that twisted westward. The land grew less harsh with every mile, though it was still scarred by years of fire and ruin. Scraggly grass pushed up between the rocks, and thorn bushes clung stubbornly to the slopes. To the rangers, even these meager signs of life were a balm. Leorthil, the youngest among them, pointed out a small trickle of water running down a gully wall. His face lit up like a child's, and though the stream was little more than a thin line over stone, the men crowded to fill their skins and splash their faces. The horses drank deeply, and for the first time since leaving Barad-dûr, their eyes grew calmer. "We are close now," Ardamir said as he watched the water run. "Ithilien is not far beyond these ridges. A few more days, perhaps less." His words lifted the men's spirits. They rode on with renewed strength, though all kept a wary eye to the east. Twice more they glimpsed movement on the ridges, pale eyes glimmering faintly before vanishing into the rocks. But no attack came. It was on the 3rd evening that they reached the mouth of a wide valley. To the west lay rolling hills, their slopes dappled with the faintest green of early spring. Beyond those hills, hidden from view, lay the Anduin and the white towers of Minas Tirith. Elberon felt his heart stir at the thought, but the sight before him held his gaze longer. At the far end of the valley stood a ruin, the broken shell of an old watchtower, blackened by fire, yet still standing. Its stones were half buried in ash, and its jagged crown leaned like the stump of a tooth. Smoke drifted faintly from within, though no fire was seen. The horses balked, stamping nervously. The men shifted uneasily, their hands on their hilts. "We should pass it by," Ardamir muttered. "There is ill air in that place." Elberon studied the ruin. It was not large, nor did it seem strong enough to hold danger. Yet his heart told him otherwise. The smoke, faint though it was, disturbed him. No living man dwelt here, of that he was certain. "We will not linger," he said, "but the valley is too narrow to ride wide around it. Keep your weapons close and be ready." They moved cautiously, the horses snorting and tossing their heads. The ruin loomed larger as they neared, its stones black with old soot. The doorway yawned open, a mouth of darkness. From within came a whispering sound, like the sigh of wind through broken walls. Then, without warning, the pale-eyed creatures poured out. They came in a wave, dozens of them, their claws scraping on the stones, their mouths gaping in silent cries. Their eyes glowed fiercely in the dim light, cold and merciless. "Hold fast," Elberon cried, drawing his sword. His men wheeled into a line, their torches blazing. The first creatures leapt, but steel and fire met them, scattering them to ash. The battle raged in the valley. The creatures swarmed from every side, their limbs lashing, their pale eyes burning. The rangers fought desperately, their torches thrusting, their blades flashing. Horses screamed and reared as the shadows clawed at their flanks. Elberon cut down one foe, then another, his sword a blur of silver in the gloom. But for every creature destroyed, 2 more leapt forward. They were endless, like the tide. "They mean to trap us," Ardamir shouted, his spear sweeping through the horde. "If we stay, we are lost." Elberon's mind raced. He looked at the ruin, its doorway still spilling forth pale-eyed horrors. Fire. That was the answer. Fire had driven them before. If they could burn the ruin, perhaps it would scatter them all. "Leorthil," he called, "take the oil from the packs. Drench the stones." The young ranger obeyed, leaping from his horse and dragging a skin of lamp oil from his saddle. He splashed it across the ruin's doorway, his hands trembling. 2 more rangers joined him, their torches ready. "Now," Elberon cried. The torches flew, striking the oiled stones. Flames leapt at once, climbing the walls, racing into the dark interior. A roar filled the air, and smoke poured out in thick black coils. The pale-eyed creatures shrieked as the fire touched them. Many fled, their bodies crumbling to ash before they could escape. The rest scattered across the valley, retreating into the rocks. Their eyes glimmered faintly for a moment, then vanished. At last the valley was quiet again, save for the crackle of fire and the labored breathing of men and horses. The ruin blazed fiercely, flames licking the sky. Elberon lowered his sword, his chest heaving. His men gathered around him, their faces smeared with ash and sweat. Leorthil's hands still shook from throwing the oil, but his eyes were bright with triumph. "Are they gone?" he asked. "For now," Elberon said. He looked at the ruin, the flames consuming it. "But I fear they are not ended. These shadows cannot be slain as other foes. They are bound to something greater. Until that is destroyed, they will return." Ardamir placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we must bring word to the king. If any can unravel such darkness, it is he." Elberon nodded, though unease lingered in his heart. He remembered the whisper at the coffer's breaking, and the shape he thought he had seen within. Could Aragorn, even as king, undo what had been loosed? That night, they camped on the far side of the valley, far from the burning ruin. The firelight glowed behind the ridges like a red star, and smoke drifted into the sky. The men kept double watch, their torches blazing, but no shadows came. Elberon lay awake, listening to the crackle of flames and the quiet breathing of his men. At last he rose and walked to the edge of camp. The stars were faint above, but one shone brighter than the rest, steady and clear. He gazed upon it and thought of his father in Ithilien, and of the king in Minas Tirith, and of all the green lands beyond. "We will reach them," he whispered to himself. "We must." But as he turned back toward the camp, he thought he heard again that faint mocking whisper drifting on the night wind. "This is not the end. The fire in the ruined tower burned for 2 days, its smoke trailing into the gray sky. By then, Elberon and his company had pressed far to the west, climbing out of the valley and into the hills that marked Mordor's edge. The land changed with every mile. Ash and slag gave way to dry scrub, then to thin grass clinging to stony soil. Birds returned to the sky, faint at first, their cries like blessings after so much silence. The rangers rode with new strength, their eyes alight with the hope of Ithilien. Even the horses, worn and weary from long marches, lifted their heads and snorted eagerly at the sense of green things carried on the wind. "It smells of home," Leorthil said, with a grin, his face brighter than Elberon had yet seen. "By nightfall tomorrow we may see the forests of Ithilien again." The men cheered quietly at his words, and for a while laughter replaced silence. Yet Elberon did not join in. His gaze wandered off into the east, where the dark ridges of Mordor still loomed. He could not forget the pale-eyed creatures nor the whisper that haunted his thoughts. Shadows did not give up their prey so easily. That evening they camped beside a shallow stream that wound down from the hills. The water was cool and sweet, and the men drank deeply, washing the ash from their hands and faces. The horses waded gratefully, splashing until their coats gleamed. "Let us keep a lighter watch tonight," one of the older rangers suggested as they sat around the fire. "The land is fairer here, and the creatures will not dare follow us into the green." But Elberon shook his head. "No, we will keep the same watch as before. The land may seem fair, but the shadow lingers. Do not trust the night until we are safe within Gondor's borders." The men obeyed, though some grumbled quietly. Still, the watch was set, and torches burned through the dark hours. No creature came, and when dawn broke golden over the hills, the company felt their spirits lift once more. By midday they reached a high ridge, and beyond it stretched the wide green sweep of Ithilien. Trees rose tall and proud, their leaves bright with spring. Birds sang in the branches, and wild flowers bloomed across the slopes. The men halted, staring in wonder as though they had stepped into another world. "By the Valor," whispered Leorthil, his eyes shining, "we are truly home." Ardamir smiled, his face softening. "The shadow lies behind us now. Let us ride swiftly and bring our tidings to the king." The company descended the ridge eagerly, their weariness forgotten. The air grew sweeter, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The sound of running water came to their ears, and before long they rode beside a clear stream that glittered in the sun. But Elberon's heart remained heavy. As he looked back one last time, he thought he saw movement among the eastern ridges, shadows slipping from rock to rock, their pale eyes faint even in the day. "Captain?" Ardamir asked softly, following his gaze. "They are not done with us," Elberon said. "Not yet." That night they made camp beneath the boughs of Ithilien. The trees whispered softly in the breeze, and the men lay more easily than they had in many days. Some even laughed, sharing tales of home and kin. Yet Elberon did not sleep. Sometime after midnight he rose and walked a little way from the fire. The forest was peaceful, the air cool and fragrant. But as he listened, he heard a sound that did not belong, the faint scraping of stone against stone. He froze, his hand going to his sword. Slowly he turned, peering into the darkness beyond the trees. At first he saw nothing. Then between the trunks, pale eyes glimmered faintly, watching. "Elberon." The whisper drifted through the night, soft as a sigh. His blood ran cold. It was the same voice he had heard when the coffer broke. The eyes blinked and vanished. Silence returned, save for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Elberon stood for a long time, his sword drawn, but nothing came. At last he returned to camp, though he did not tell the men what he had seen. They needed rest, not fear. At dawn they rode on, following the stream north toward the road that would lead them to Minas Tirith. The forest grew thicker, the air rich with the scent of wild herbs. Birds flitted among the branches, and the men rode with lighter hearts. But the shadow was not gone. By afternoon they came to a glade where the stream widened into a pool. They halted to water the horses, laughter on their lips. It was then that the creatures struck. They came from the trees, pale-eyed and silent, their limbs long and thin, their movements swift as shadows. The horses screamed, rearing in terror as the rangers leapt to arms. "Torches!" Elberon shouted, but there was no time. The creatures were upon them. Steel clashed against claw, and the glade filled with cries. Elberon swung his sword, cleaving one foe to ash, then another. Around him the men fought desperately, their blades flashing in the dappled light. One of the creatures leapt upon Leorthil, dragging him to the ground. The boy cried out, struggling as pale claws closed around his throat. Elberon sprang forward, his sword cutting through the creature's chest. It dissolved into dust, and he dragged Leorthil to his feet. "Stay close," he cried. The battle raged. The creatures seemed endless, slipping from shadow to shadow, their pale eyes gleaming. The rangers fought with fire and steel, but the foe pressed them hard. At last, Ardamir raised his spear high, a torch lashed to its tip. He thrust it into the heart of the glade, the flames blazing. The creatures shrieked, their pale eyes flaring. Then one by one they dissolved into ash. Silence fell. The men stood panting, their weapons dripping with sweat and dust. The glade was strewn with ashes, the pool rippling from the struggle. "They followed us even here," Leorthil whispered, his voice shaking. "Into Gondor itself." Elberon's face was grim. "Yes, and they will not stop, not until we end what was begun beneath Barad-dûr." He looked to the north, where the road wound toward Minas Tirith. "The king must know," he said. "Only he can decide how this shadow shall be faced. Until then, we ride without pause." And so, weary but resolute, the company pressed on, their path leading ever closer to the White City and to the judgment that awaited them there. The journey through Ithilien was faster than any of the men had dared hope. Though they were weary from battle and sleepless nights, the green land itself seemed to lend them strength. The air smelled of pine and wild herbs. Cool breezes drifted through the trees, and bird song filled the morning sky. To men who had marched for weeks across ash and ruin, it was like stepping into another world. Leorthil laughed aloud more than once, his spirits lifted despite his bruises. Even the older rangers, grim and silent, since they had left Barad-dûr, softened their faces and breathed deeply of the forest air. The horses trotted eagerly, their coats gleaming now that they drank from clear streams and grazed on green grass. Yet Elberon's heart remained heavy. Though the land was fair, he could not forget the pale eyes in the night, nor the attack in the glade. The creatures had followed them across the very borders of Gondor, as if Mordor's shadow had crept into the heart of the realm. He feared that even in the safety of Minas Tirith, those whispers might find him still. On the third morning they came to the great north road that ran from Osgiliath to to the gates of Minas Tirith. The rangers halted as the white stones stretched before them, straight and wide beneath the rising sun. "There," Ardamir said softly, his voice filled with awe. He pointed westward. Far in the distance, gleaming in the morning light, stood the White City. Its towers rose tier upon tier against the backdrop of the mountains, its walls shining with the new stone and craft that had mended the scars of war. High above all, the tower of Ecthelion caught the sun, its banner of the white tree unfurling in the breeze. The men stared, their weariness forgotten. Even Leorthil fell silent, his eyes wide with wonder. "Minas Tirith," Elberon murmured. His voice held both relief and unease, for though the city was fair, he knew what tidings they must bring to its king. They rode swiftly along the road, and before noon they reached the great gates. The guards, clad in silver and black, lowered their spears in salute as Elberon approached. One stepped forward, his helm shining. "Captain Elberon, son of the steward," he said, "the king awaits you. Word of your coming has already reached the tower." Elberon inclined his head, though surprise flickered in his heart. How had word traveled so swiftly? Still, he led his company through the gates, into the wide streets of the first circle. The city was alive with people. Merchants cried their wares, children ran laughing through the lanes, and banners hung bright from the windows. Yet as the rangers passed, the noise stilled, faces turned, and whispers followed them, dusty and worn from long roads, their cloaks torn and their weapons blackened with ash. They looked more like ghosts than men. Step by step they climbed through the city, the cobbled streets winding upward through each tier. At last they came to the citadel, where the tower of Ecthelion rose high above all. The guards opened the doors, and Elberon led his men into the great hall. King Elisar sat upon the throne, clad not in mail, but in a simple robe of white and green. His crown was upon his brow, yet his bearing was as that of a man rather than a lord. At his side stood Queen Arwen, her beauty like a star's light, calm and unearthly. Faramir, Elberon's father, was also present, his gray eyes watchful and wise. The rangers knelt as one. "Rise, my friends," Aragorn said, his voice deep and kind. "You have returned from Mordor, and for that I give thanks. Tell me now, what did you find among the ruins of the Dark Tower?" Elberon rose slowly, his heart pounding. He glanced at his father, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "My lord," Elberon began, his voice steady though his hands trembled, "we searched the ruins of Barad-dûr, as you commanded. Much was broken and buried. Yet beneath the wreckage we found passages still whole, deep vaults that had not fallen with the tower." A murmur ran through the hall. Aragorn's eyes darkened, though his voice remained calm. "Go on." "In those depths," Elberon continued, "we found relics of Gondor's past, weapons taken from our fallen and stored in mockery. But worse was a chamber, wherein lay a coffer, bound in iron and marked with runes of power. Within it dwelt a malice that gave life to stone guardians who barred our way. We fought them, and by breaking the coffer, we destroyed them." Arwen's gaze sharpened, and Faramir's eyes grew grave. "But my lord," Elberon said, lowering his voice, "when the coffer broke, something else was released. A shadow, formless and vast, fled from it. Since that day creatures have followed us, pale-eyed things of ash and dust, born of that shadow. They harried us even in Ithilien. We fought them with fire, but they return again and again. I fear they are bound to whatever escaped the coffer's keeping." The hall fell silent. All eyes were on the king. Aragorn's face was stern, though his eyes softened with pity as they rested on Elberon. "You did rightly to destroy the coffer," he said at last. "No remnant of Sauron's craft should remain. Yet shadows do not vanish easily. The enemy was great in guile, and fragments of his will may yet linger." He rose from the throne, tall and kingly. "You have done your duty with honor, though the task was heavy. Fear not, for Gondor shall not stand alone against this threat. We will summon council and decide how best to cleanse what remains." Faramir stepped forward then, placing a hand upon his son's shoulder. "You have done well, Elberon," he said quietly. "Few men could have faced such shadows and lived. I am proud." Elberon bowed his head, though unease still gnawed at him. For even here, in the safety of Minas Tirith, he thought he felt a chill, as though unseen eyes lingered in the corners of the hall. As the council dispersed, Aragorn beckoned Elberon aside. "Captain," the king said in a low voice, "tell me truly, when the coffer broke, what did you see?" Elberon hesitated. Then he spoke the truth. "A shape, my lord. For a moment only, a shadow, vast and formless, as though it longed for a body, and a voice that whispered, 'This is not the end.'" Aragorn's eyes darkened further, and he laid a hand upon Elberon's arm. "You are brave to speak it. Guard your heart, for shadows often seek to enter where fear gives them door. Rest now and leave the burden to us. You have carried it long enough." Elberon bowed deeply. "As you command, my lord." Yet even as he left the hall, the whisper stirred again in his mind, faint and mocking. "This is not the end." The bells of Minas Tirith tolled at dawn, their silver voices echoing through the streets. Elberon stood upon a balcony of the steward's house, looking out over the city as the sun crept above the mountains. The white tower gleamed in the morning light, its banner bright against the sky. From below rose the sounds of life, the chatter of merchants, the ring of hammers, the cries of children at play. To most it was a day like any other, peaceful, prosperous, free. But Elberon could not find peace. His dreams had been filled with pale eyes, and when he woke he swore he heard whispers clinging to the stone walls, too faint to catch, too cold to forget. The city seemed fair, yet in its shadows he felt watched. Faramir joined him on the balcony, his face lined with wisdom and care. "You did well before the king yesterday," his father said. "You spoke truly, though the truth was hard. Few young captains would have had such courage." Elberon bowed his head. "And yet, father, I feel no triumph. The shadow we loosed pursues me still. I fear it pursues all Gondor." Faramir's gaze turned westward, where the river Anduin shone like a silver ribbon. "Shadows pursue all men, my son, but what matters is how we face them. The king has called a council for this evening. There we shall decide what is to be done." The council was held in the great chamber of the White Tower. Aragorn sat at its head with Arwen beside him, her calm presence lending light to the hall. Faramir was there, and Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, stern and gray-haired. From the north had come envoys of Rohan, tall and fair, and from the south captains of Gondor's fleets. When all were gathered, Aragorn rose. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying clear, "a new shadow stirs in the east. Captain Elberon and his company have returned from Barad-dûr with tidings both grave and strange. Listen now to their tale, for what they found concerns us all." Elberon stood and recounted once more the events beneath the dark tower, the vaults, the coffer, the guardians, and the pale-eyed creatures that had followed them, even into Ithilien. He spoke plainly, his voice steady, though his hands clenched at his sides. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the hall. At last, Prince Imrahil spoke. If these creatures are but fragments of shadow, then they are no true army. Gondor has faced worse. Let us hunt them down, burn them with fire, and be done. But Faramir shook his head. You do not understand. Shadows cannot be fought as armies are fought. They are of another kind, born of will and malice. Strike them and they return. Burn them and they rise elsewhere. Until the source is broken, they will not cease. Then where lies the source? Asked one of the captains. Aragorn's eyes darkened. In Mordor still. The coffer is shattered, yet its making was not of simple craft. It was wrought with sorcery, binding fragments of the enemy's will. If such things remain buried in the ruins of Barad-dûr, they may yet give rise to terrors untold. We cannot leave them to fester. Murmurs filled the chamber. Some urged a great host be sent to cleanse Mordor once and for all. Others counseled caution, fearing to stir what slept. As the debate swelled, the chamber grew suddenly cold. The torches guttered, their flames shrinking. A whisper rose, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the hall. This is not the end. The voices fell silent. All turned, their faces pale, their eyes wide. The whisper came again, curling around the pillars like smoke. You broke the vessel, you set me free. I will not be bound again. The queen rose, her face grave, her eyes alight with a cold fire. It is here, Arwen said softly. The shadow has entered the city. The council broke into cries, some reaching for their swords, though no foe could be seen. The torches flickered wildly, and for a moment the hall was plunged into near darkness. Then pale eyes appeared in the corners of the chamber, glowing faintly, cold and merciless. Dozens of them. Defend the king, cried Imrahil, drawing his blade. The pale-eyed creatures leapt from the shadows, skittering across the floor. Their claws raked the stones, their mouths gaping in silent laughter. Panic filled the chamber as steel rang out. Elberon drew his sword at once, placing himself before the throne. To me, he shouted, Rangers of Ithilien, to me! The rangers, though weary from their journey, leapt to his side. They struck with steel and torches, cutting down the creatures one by one. Ash filled the air, the cries of battle echoing in the high chamber. Aragorn himself rose, and Duriel blazing in his hands. The sword shone with a white light, and wherever its edge fell, the creatures shrieked and dissolved into nothing. Back, the king commanded, his voice like thunder. You have no place in this city. For a moment the creatures faltered, their pale eyes dimming, but then the whisper came again, deeper and stronger, shaking the very stones. You cannot drive me out. I was before you, and I shall endure after. This city will be mine. The torches flared suddenly, bursting into tall flames. The creatures shrieked and fled into the shadows, their pale eyes winking out one by one. In moments the hall was empty, save for the men, panting and shaken, their blades blackened with ash. Silence fell, heavy and fearful. This is no common foe, Faramir said at last, his face grim. It has found a voice, and with it, power. Aragorn lowered Andúril slowly, his eyes burning with resolve. Then we must cut it off at its root. What was loosed beneath Barad-dûr must be bound again, or destroyed utterly. Gondor will not live under such a shadow. He turned to Elberon. You have faced it already, Captain. Will you lead us back into Mordor to end this evil where it began? Elberon's heart pounded. Fear gripped him, yet alongside it burned a fire he could not quench. He thought of the whisper that had haunted his dreams, of the pale eyes in the night, of his men who had bled and fought at his side. He bowed his head. "Yes, my lord, I will go." And though his voice was steady, the whisper came once more, soft and mocking, curling through the corners of his mind. This is not the end. Preparations were swift. Gondor did not raise a great host, for Aragorn judged that armies would be of little use against such an enemy. Instead, he chose a company of the bravest and most steadfast, rangers of Ithilien, knights of Dol Amroth, and a handful of Dúnedain who had come south with him in days past. At their head he placed Elberon, for none knew the shadow's ways better than he. Elberon felt the weight of that charge keenly. He spent the night before their departure walking the silent streets of Minas Tirith, his heart heavy with fear and hope alike. More than once he thought he heard whispers drifting through the alleys, though when he turned he saw only moonlit stone. At dawn he stood before his father. "Do not doubt yourself," Faramir said, clasping his son's shoulder. "You are of Gondor and of Rohan both, and in you runs the blood of kings and captains. But more than that, you are true of heart. That is what will see you through." Elberon embraced him, then mounted his horse and rode with the company out through the great gates. The white tree shone above them in the morning light, a sign of hope as they set forth once more into the east. The journey back through Ithilien was swift. Scouts ranged ahead, and though the pale-eyed creatures were seen at a distance more than once, they did not draw near. Perhaps they were waiting, gathering their strength in the ruins that birthed them. By the time the company reached the Ephel-Duath, a hush had fallen. The mountains loomed black and jagged, their peaks lost in smoke. They crossed through the pass in silence, each man gripping his weapon tightly. On the far side, Mordor stretched before them, gray plains, broken ridges, and the smoldering cone of Mount Doom. Even hardened warriors felt dread at the sight, but Elberon's voice rang steady as he gave the order to advance. For 2 days they marched across the barren land. The wind blew thin and cold, carrying with it the faint scent of ash. At night, the creatures came, their pale eyes glimmering in the dark. But this time the company was ready. Torches blazed bright, and the creatures were driven back again and again. Still, their whispers carried on the night air, hissing promises and threats. "You cannot bind us. You cannot destroy us. This is not the end." At last they reached the heap of ruins that had once been Barad-dûr. It loomed like a mountain of broken stone and twisted iron, casting long shadows across the plain. The men halted, their faces grim. "This is where it began," Elberon said, "and here it must end." They climbed into the ruins, the stones shifting under their boots. The air grew heavy, foul with the stench of old fire. As they neared the place where Elberon and his rangers had once found the stair, the ground shuddered. From the rubble rose the pale-eyed creatures in their hundreds, their bodies swarming like ants, their whispers filling the air. The company formed a circle, torches and swords blazing. Aragorn stood at Elberon's side, Andúril shining with a light like the stars. "Do not falter," the king cried. "These shadows cannot master the living while hope endures." The battle began. The creatures leapt, their claws flashing. Steel rang, fire roared, and the plain shook with the clash. Many fell to ash beneath Gondor's blades, yet more poured forth, endless and relentless. Elberon fought with all his strength, his sword cutting swift and true. He struck one, then another, his shield, splintering under the force of their blows. Around him men cried out, but they did not falter. The circle held, then the ground split, and from the depths rose a greater shadow, vast, formless, towering above the ruin. Its eyes were pale fires, and its voice thundered like the roar of the mountain. You broke the vessel, you freed me, now I will claim this land, and all your hope will turn to ash. The men faltered, terror clutching their hearts. Even Elberon staggered, his sword heavy in his hand. But Aragorn lifted Anduril high, its light blazing. You have no power here, the king cried. The ring is gone, and your master is overthrown. You are but a remnant, a shadow of a shadow. The great form shrieked, the sound splitting the air. Pale-eyed creatures surged forward in renewed fury. Elberon's mind raced. He thought of the coffer, of the guardians, of the whisper that had haunted him. This was not merely a foe of flesh or stone, it was a will, clinging to the world through fragments of old sorcery. To destroy it, they must strike at its heart. Aragorn, he shouted above the din. The coffer's place, the dais below, that is where it was bound. If we burn it, perhaps the last of its strength will be broken. The king's eyes met his, and he nodded once. Then lead us. With a cry, Elberon plunged forward, cutting a path through the horde. The company followed, torches blazing, blades flashing. Step by step, they forced their way to the stair, driving the creatures back with fire. Down they plunged into the depths, the shadows' roar echoing above them. At last they reached the great chamber where the coffer had stood. The dais was cracked, but the marks of sorcery still glimmered faintly. The pale-eyed creatures poured in after them, shrieking, their claws clattering on the stone. "Oil!" Elberon shouted. "Torches! Burn it all!" The men splashed oil across the dais and the walls, their torches flaring. Flames leapt high, racing along the cracks, consuming the runes. The chamber shook, the air filled with the sound of shrieking, not from throats of flesh, but from the very stones. The vast shadow above wailed, its form twisting, shrinking, breaking apart. The pale-eyed creatures dissolved into dust, their cries fading. The flames roared higher, licking the roof of the cavern. Elberon stood at the dais, his torch raised high. "You will not haunt Gondor again," he cried, and he thrust the torch into the heart of the fire. Light blazed, the chamber filled with white fire, pure and fierce. The shadow screamed one last time, then was gone. When the flames died, silence fell. The dais lay in ruins, the runes blackened and dead. No whisper stirred, no pale eyes gleamed. Aragorn laid a hand upon Elberon's shoulder. "It is finished," the king said softly. Elberon sank to his knees, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. He felt the weight of weeks lift from him at last. The whisper that had haunted him was gone. They climbed from the depths into the daylight. The ruins of Barad-dûr stood silent, the wind whispering over stone. The pale-eyed creatures were no more. The shadow had been broken. That night, the company camped on the plain of Gorgoroth. The stars shone bright above, and the air was clean. Elberon lay beneath the sky, his heart at peace for the first time since entering Mordor. When dawn came, they rode westward, leaving the dark tower behind forever. And though the land of Mordor was scarred and black, Elberon knew that its secrets no longer threatened Gondor. The shadow was ended and the world was brighter for it.